Hey everybody, this is chapter 9 of Louis Althusser's The Object of Capital. This is his section from Reading Capital. The first chapter is titled Introduction, the second, Marx and His Discoveries, Chapter 3, The Merits of Classical Economics, Chapter 4, The Errors of Classical Economics, Outline of a Concept of Historical Time, Chapter 5, Marxism is not a Historicism, Chapter 6, The Epistemological Propositions of Capital, Marx, Engels. 7, The Object of Political Economy. 8, Marx's Critique. 9, this chapter, Marx's Immense Theoretical Revolution. And an appendix on the, quote, ideal average, end quote, and the forms of transition. Let's party. Marx's Immense Theoretical Revolution, Chapter 9, Marx's Immense Theoretical Revolution. We can now go back to the past and assess the distance between Marx and Marx's predecessors, and between his object and theirs. From now on, we can abandon the issue of anthropology, whose function in political economy was to establish both the economic nature of economic phenomena by the theory of the Homo economicus, and their existence in the homogeneous space of a given. Once this anthropological, quote, given, end quote, has been removed, the space remains, which is precisely what interests us. What happens to it in its beginning, once it can no longer be based on the anthropology? What effects does this omission have on it? Political economy thought the economic phenomena as derived from a planar space governed by a transitive mechanical causality, such that a determinate effect could be related to an object cause, a different phenomena, such that the necessity of its imminence could be grasped completely in the sequence of a given. The homogeneity of this space, the space's planar character, this space's property of givenness, its type of linear causality, these are so many theoretical determinations which, as a system, constitute the structure of a theoretical problematic, i.e., of a certain way of conceiving its object, and at the same time opposing it definitive questions, defined by the problematic itself as to its beginning, while anticipating the form of its answers, the quantitative schema. In short, an empiricist problematic. Marx's theory is radically opposed to this conception. Not that it is an, quote, inversion, end quote, of it. It is different, theoretically unrelated to it, and therefore in rupture with it, because Marx defined the economic by the economics concept. Marx does not present economic phenomena to illustrate his thought temporarily with a spatial metaphor in the infinity of a homogeneous planar space, but rather in a region determined by a regional structure and itself inscribed in a site defined by a global structure, therefore a complex and deep space, itself inscribed in another complex and deep space. But let us abandon this spatial metaphor, since this first opposition exhausts its virtues. Everything depends, in fact, on the nature of this depth, or, more strictly speaking, of this complexity. To define economic phenomena by the economic phenomena's concept is to define economic phenomena by the concept of this complexity, i.e., by the concept of the global structure, of the mode of production, insofar as it determines the regional structure, which constitutes its economic objects and determines the phenomena of this defined region, located in a defined site in the structure of the whole. At the economic level, strictly speaking, the structure constituting and determining economic objects is the following: the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production. The concept of this last structure cannot be defined without the concept of the global structure of the mode of production. Once we have simply put Marx's fundamental theoretical concepts in their places and posed them in the unity of a theoretical discourse, a number of important consequences follow. First, the economic cannot have the qualities of a given, of the immediate visibility and observable, because the economic's identification requires the concept of the structure of the economic, which in turn requires the concepts of the structure of the mode of production, its different levels and their specific articulations, because its identification therefore presupposes the construction of its concept. The concept of the economic must be structured for each mode of production, as must the concept of each of the other, quote, levels, end quote, that belong to the mode of production, the political, the ideological, etc. Like every other science, therefore, all economic science depends on the construction of the concept of its object. On this condition, there is no contradiction between the theory of economics and the theory of history. On the contrary, the theory of economics is a subordinate region of the theory of history, understood, of course, in the non-historicist, non-empiricist sense in which we have outlined the theory of history. And just as any, quote, history, end quote, which does not work out the concept of its object, but claims to, quote, read, end quote, it immediately in what is visible in the, quote, field, end quote, of historical phenomena, is still bound willy-nilly to be tainted with empiricism, any, quote, political economy, end quote, which goes to the, quote, things themselves, end quote, i.e. to the, quote, concrete, the, quote, given, without constructing the concept of its object, is willy-nilly caught in the toils of an empiricist ideology, and constantly threatened by the reemergence of its true, quote, objects, end quote, i.e. its objectives, whether these are the ideals of classical liberalism or those of a, quote, humanism, end quote, of labor, even a socialist one. Second, if the, quote, field, end quote, of economic phenomena no longer has the homogeneity of an infinite plane, the field of economic phenomena's objects are no longer de jure homogeneous at all points with one another. The, quote, field of economic phenomena's objects are therefore no longer uniformly susceptible to comparison and measurement. This by no means excludes from economics the possibility of measurement or of the intervention of the instruments of mathematics in its peculiar modalities, etc., but does make it from now on subject to prior conceptual definitions of the site and limits of the measurable, and of the sites and limits to which the other resources of mathematical science, e.g. the instruments of econometrics and other formalization procedures, can be applied. Mathematical formalization must be subordinate to conceptual formalization. Here, too, the limits between political economy and empiricism, even formalistic empiricism, coincide with the boundary between the concept of the theoretical object and the, quote, concrete, end quote, object, along with even the, quote, mathematical, end quote, protocols of its manipulation. The practical consequences of this principle are obvious, e.g. in the solution of the, quote, technical, end quote, problems of planning, in which, quote, problems, end quote, which arise quite simply from the absence of the concept of the object, i.e. from economic empiricism, are frequently treated as real, quote, technical, end quote, problems. The intellectual, quote, technocracy, end quote, lives by this kind of confusion, securing its full-time employment with it, for nothing takes so long to resolve as a problem which does not exist or has been badly posed. Third, if the field of economic phenomena is no longer this planar space, but a deep and complex space, if economic phenomena are determined by their complexity, i.e., economic phenomena's structure, the concept of linear causality can no longer be applied to economic phenomena, as linear causality has been applied to economic phenomena hitherto. A different concept is required in order to account for the new form of causality required by the new definition of the object of political economy, by its, quote, complexity, end quote, i.e. by its peculiar determination, the determination by a structure. The determination by a structure. This third consequence deserves our whole attention, for it introduces us to an absolutely new theoretical domain. An object cannot be defined by that object's immediately visible or sensuous appearance. It is necessary to make a detour via its concept in order to grasp it. Begreifen equal grasp, begriff equal concept. These theses have a familiar ring to them. At least these theses are the lesson of the whole history of modern science, more or less reflected in classical philosophy, even if this reflection took place in the element of an empiricism, whether transcendent, as in Descartes, transcendental, Kant and Husserl, or, quote, objective and, quote, idealist, Hegel. It is true that much theoretical work is needed to deal with all the forms of this empiricism sublimated in the, quote, theory of knowledge, end quote, which dominates Western philosophy, to break with its problematic of subject, cogito, and object, and all their variations. But at least all these philosophical ideologies do, quote, allude, end quote, to a real necessity, imposed against this tenacious empiricism by the theoretical practice of the real sciences, i.e., that the knowledge of a real object is not reached by immediate contact with the, quote, concrete, end quote, but by the production of the concept of that object, in the sense of object of knowledge, as the absolute condition of its theoretical possibility. If formally, the task which Marx has allotted to us in forcing us to produce the concept of the economic in order to be able to constitute a theory of political economy, in obliging us to define by its concept the domain, limits, and conditions of validity of mathematization of that object, if it does break with all the empiricist idealist traditions of Western critical philosophy, then it is no sense in rupture with effective scientific practice. On the contrary, Marx's requirements restate in a new domain the requirements which have long been imposed on the practices of those sciences which have achieved autonomy. These requirements often conflict with the practices that have reigned and still do reign in economic science, practices which are deeply steeped in empiricist ideology, but this is undoubtedly because of the youth of this, quote, science, end quote, and also because, quote, economic science, end quote, is especially exposed to the pressure of ideology. The sciences of society do not have the serenity of the mathematical sciences. As Hobbes put it, geometry unites men, social science divides men. Quote, economic science, end quote, is the arena and the prize of history's great political battles. But our third conclusion is quite different, and so is the requirement it imposes on us to think the economic phenomena as determined by a regional structure, of the mode of production, itself determined by the global structure of the mode of production. This requirement poses Marx a problem which is not only a scientific problem, i.e. one that arises from the theoretical practice of a definite science, political economy, or history, but a theoretical or philosophical problem, since it concerns precisely the production of a concept or set of concepts which necessarily affect the forms of existing scientificity, or theoretical rationality themselves, the forms which at a given moment define the theoretical as such, i.e. the object of philosophy. Footnote, see Part 1, Section 14. End footnote. This problem certainly does involve the production of a theoretical philosophical concept which is absolutely indispensable to the constitution of a rigorous discourse in the theory of history and the theory of political economy. The production of an indispensable philosophical concept which does not exist in the form of a concept. Perhaps it is too soon to suggest that the birth of every new science inevitably poses theoretical philosophical problems of this kind. Engels thought so, and we have every reason to believe him if we examine what happened at the time of the birth of mathematics in Greece, at the time of the constitution of Galilean physics, of infinitesimal calculus, at the time of the foundation of chemistry and biology, etc. In several of these conjunctures, we find the following remarkable phenomenon: the, quote, reprise, end quote, of a basic scientific discovery and philosophical reflection, and the production by philosophy of a new form of rationality. Plato, after the discoveries of the mathematicians of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, Descartes after Galileo, Leibniz with infinitesimal calculus, etc. The philosophical, quote, reprise, end quote, this production by philosophy of new theoretical concepts which solve the theoretical problems contained in, quote, the practical state, end quote, if not explicitly posed, in the great scientific discoveries in question, mark the great breaks in the history of the theoretical, i.e. the history of philosophy. However, it seems that certain scientific disciplines have established themselves or thought themselves established by the mere extension of an existing form of rationality, psychophysiology, psychology, etc., which would tend to suggest that not any scientific foundation ipso facto induces a revolution in the theoretical, but presumably only a scientific foundation which is obliged to reorganize practically the existing problematic in the theoretical in order to think its object, the philosophy capable of reflecting the upheaval produced by the emergence of such a science, by bringing to light a new form of rationality, scientificity, apodicticity, which would then mark by its existence a decisive punctuation, a revolution in the history of the theoretical. Bearing in mind what has been said elsewhere of the delay required for the philosophical production of this new rationality, and even of the historical repression to which certain theoretical revolutions may be subjected, it seems that Marx offers us precisely an example of this importance. The epistemological problem posed by Marx's radical modification of political economy can be expressed as follows. By means of what concept is it possible to think the new type of determination, which has been identified as the determination of the phenomena of a given region by the structure of that region? More generally, by means of what concept, or what set of concepts, is it possible to think the determination of the elements of a structure, and the structural relations between these elements, and all the effects of those relations, by the effectivity of that structure? And, a fortiori, by means of what concept, or what set of concepts is it possible to think the determination of a subordinate structure by a dominant structure? In other words, how is it possible to define the concept of a structural causality? I'm going to repeat that entire half of the paragraph because it's all in italics. The epistemological problem posed by Marx's radical modification of political economy can be expressed as follows. By means of what concept is it possible to think the new type of determination which has just been identified as the determination of the phenomena of a given region by the structure of that region? More generally, by means of what concept or what set of concepts is it possible to think the determination of the elements of a structure, and the structural relations between those elements, and all the effects of those relations by the effectivity of that structure? And, a fortiori, by means of what concept or what set of concepts is it possible to think the determination of a subordinate structure by a dominant structure? In other words, how is it possible to define the concept of a structural causality? This simple theoretical question sums up Marx's extraordinary scientific discovery, the discovery of the theory of history and political economy, the discovery of Capital, the book. But it sums it up as an extraordinary theoretical question contained in, quote, in the practical state, end quote, in Marx's scientific discovery, the question Marx, quote, practiced, end quote, in his work, in answer to which he gave his scientific work without producing the concept of it in a philosophical opus of the same rigor. This simple question was so new and unforeseen that it contained enough to smash all the classical theories of causality, or enough to ensure that it would be unrecognized, that it would pass unperceived and be buried even before it was born. Very schematically, we can say that classical philosophy, the existing capital T theoretical, had two and only two systems of concepts with which to think effectivity. The mechanistic system, Cartesian in origin, which reduced causality to a transitive and analytically effective, and it could not be made to think the effectivity of a whole on its elements, except at the cost of extraordinary distortions, such as those in Descartes' quote, psychology, end quote, and biology. But a second system was available, one conceived precisely But a second system was available, one conceived precisely in order to deal with the effectivity of a whole on its elements, the Leibnizian concept of expression. The Leibnizian concept of expression. The Leibnizian concept of expression is the model that dominates all Hegel's thought, but it presupposes in principle that the whole in question be reducible to an inner essence, of which the elements of the whole are then no more than the phenomenal forms of expression, the inner principle of the essence being present at each point in the whole, such that at each moment it is possible to write the immediately adequate equation, such and such an element, economic, political, legal, literary, religious, etc., in Hegel, equal to the inner essence of the whole. such and such an element, economic, political, legal, literary, religious, etc., in Hegel, equal to the inner essence of the whole. Here was a model which made it possible to think the effectivity of the whole on each of its elements. But if this category, inner essence / outer phenomena, was to be applicable everywhere and at every moment to each of the phenomena arising in the totality in expression, it presupposed that the whole had a certain nature, precisely the nature of a, quote, spiritual, end quote, whole, in which each element was expressive of the entire totality as a, quote, pars totalis, end quote. I'm going to repeat that. It's in italics. It presupposed that the whole had a certain nature, precisely the nature of a, quote, spiritual, end quote, whole, in which each element was expressive of the entire totality as a, quote, pars totalis, end quote. In other words, Leibniz and Hegel did have a category for the effectivity of the whole in its elements or parts, but on the absolute condition that the whole is not a structure. If the whole is posed as structure, i.e. is possessing a type of unity quite different from the type of unity of the spiritual whole, this is no longer the case. Not only does it become impossible to think the determination of the elements of by the structure in the categories of analytical or transitive causality, it also becomes impossible to think it in the category of the global expressive causality of a universal inner essence immanent in its phenomena. It also becomes impossible to think it in the category of the global expressive causality of a universal inner essence immanent in its phenomena. The proposal to think the determination of the elements of a whole by the structure of the whole posed an absolutely new problem in the most theoretically embarrassing circumstances, for there were no philosophical concepts available for its resolution. The only theoretician who had the unprecedented daring to pose this problem and outline a first solution to it was Spinoza. But as we know, history has buried Spinoza in impenetrable darkness. Only through Marx, who, however, had little knowledge of Spinoza, do we even begin to guess at the features of this trampled face. Of that trampled face. This is merely to return to the most general form of a fundamental and dramatic theoretical problem of which the preceding studies have given us a precise idea. I call it a fundamental problem because it is clear that by other paths, contemporary theory and psychoanalysis, linguistics, other disciplines such as biology and perhaps even physics has had to confront it without suspecting that Marx had, quote, produced, and, quote, it in the true sense long ago. I call it a dramatic theoretical problem because although Marx, quote, produced, end quote, this problem, he did not pose it as a problem. Although Marx, quote, produced, end quote, this problem, Marx did not pose this problem as a problem, but set out to solve the problem practically in the absence of the problem's concept, with extraordinary ingenuity, without completely avoiding a relapse into earlier schemata, which were necessarily inadequate to pose and solve this problem. It is on this problem that Marx is attempting to focus in the tentative sentences we can read in the 1857 introduction. Quote, in all forms of society there is one specific kind of production which predominates over the rest, whose relations thus assign rank and influence to the others. It is a general illumination, Beleuchtung, which bathes all the other colors and modifies their particularity. It is a particular either which determines the specific gravity of every being which has materialized within it. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse said. This text is discussing the determination of certain structures of production which are subordinate to a dominant structure of production, i.e. the determination of one structure by another structure and of the elements of a subordinate structure by the dominant and therefore determinate structure. I have previously attempted to account for this phenomenon with the concept of overdetermination. Which I borrowed from psychoanalysis. As one might suppose, this transfer of an analytical concept to Marx's theory was not an arbitrary borrowing but a necessary borrowing, for the same theoretical problem is at stake in both cases. With what concept are we to think the determinations Sorry, let me repeat that. I have previously attempted to account for this phenomenon with the concept of overdetermination, which I borrowed from psychoanalysis. As one might suppose, this transfer of an analytical concept to Marxist theory was not an arbitrary borrowing, but a necessary borrowing. For the same theoretical problem is at stake in both cases. With what concept are we to think the determination of either an element or a structure by a structure? With what concept are we to think the determination of either an element or a structure by a structure? It is this same problem that Marx has in view, and which Marx is trying to focus by introducing the metaphor of a variation in the general illumination of the ether in which bodies are immersed, and of the subsequent alterations produced by the domination of one particular structure in the localization, function, and relations. In his own words, the relations, their rank and influence, in the original color and the specific weight of the objects. The constant and real presence of this problem in Marx has been demonstrated by the rigorous analysis of his expressions and forms of reasoning in the preceding papers. It can be entirely summed up in the concept of, quote, Darstellung, end quote, the key epistemological concept of the whole Marxist theory of value, the concept whose object is precisely to designate the mode of presence of the structure in its effects, the mode of presence of the structure in the structure's effects, and therefore to designate structural causality itself. The fact that we have isolated the concept of, quote, Darstellung, end quote, does not mean that it is the only concept which Marx uses in order to think the effectivity of the structure. A reading of the first 30 pages of Capital shows that Marx uses at least a dozen different expressions of a metaphorical kind in order to deal with this specific reality, unthought before Marx. We have retained this term because it is both the least metaphorical and at the same time the closest to the concept Marx is aiming at when he wants to designate at once both absence and presence, i.e. the existence of the structure and its effects, i.e. the existence of the structure in the structure's effects. This is an extremely important point if we are to avoid even the slightest, in a sense, inadvertent relapse into the diversions of the classical conception of the economic object. The classical conception of the economic object. If we were to avoid saying that the Marxist conception of the economic object is for Marx determined from the outside by a non-economic structure. The structure is not, in essence, outside the economic phenomena, which comes and alters the economic phenomena's aspect, forms, and relations, and which is effective on the economic phenomena as an absent cause, absent because it is outside the economic phenomena, the absence of the cause in the structure's, quote, metonymic causality, end quote. The absence of the cause in the structure's, quote, metonymic causality, end quote, on its effects is not the fault of the exteriority of the structure with respect to the economic phenomena. It is not the fault of the exteriority of the structure with respect to the economic phenomena. On the contrary, it is the very form of the interiority of the structure, as a structure in its effects. On the contrary, it is the very form of the interiority of the structure, as a structure in its effects. This implies, therefore, that the effects are not outside the structure, are not a pre-existing object, element, or space in which the structure arrives to imprint its mark. On the contrary, it implies that structure is immanent in its effects, a cause immanent in its effects in the Spinoza sense of the term, that the whole existence of the structure consists of its effects. In short, that the structure, which is merely a specific combination of its peculiar elements, is nothing outside its effects. This specification is very important when we have to deal with the occasionally strange form which the discovery of this reality and the search for expression of it for it take, even in Marx. To understand these strange forms, it is essential to note the exteriority of the structure with respect to its effects can be conceived either as a pure exteriority or as an interiority, on the sole condition that this exteriority or interiority are posed as distinct from their effects. This exteriority or interiority are posed as distinct from their effects. In Marx, this distinction often takes the classical form of the distinction between the inside and the outside, between the, quote, intimate essence, end quote, of things and their phenomenal, quote, surface, end quote, between the, quote, the, quote, intimate relations, end quote, the, quote, intimate links, end quote, of things and the external relations and links of the same things. And it is well known that this opposition, which derives in principle from the classical distinction between essence and phenomenon, i.e. from a distinction which situates in reality itself, the inner side of its concept, and therefore opposes it to the, quote, surface, end quote, of concrete appearances, which therefore transpose as a difference of level or of components in the real object itself. A distinction which does not belong to that real object, since it is a matter of the distinction which separates the concept of knowledge of the real from the real as an existing object. It is well known that this opposition sometimes leads Marx to the following disarming pleonasm. If the essence were not different from the phenomena, if the essential interior were not different from the inessential or phenomenal exterior, there would be no need for science. If the essence were not different from the phenomena, if the essential interior were not different from the inessential or phenomenal exterior, there would be no need for science. Footnote, quote, capital volume 3, quote, all science would be superfluous if the form of appearance of things directly coincided with things' essence. End quote. This re-echoes the old dream which haunted all classical political reflection. All politics would be superfluous if men's passions and reason coincided. End footnote. It is well known that this singular formula may gain strength from all those arguments of Marx's which present the development of the concepts as the transition from the abstract to the concrete, a transition understood as the transition from the essential, in principle abstract interiority, to the concrete, visible, and palpable outer determinations, a transition summed up in the transition from Volume 1 to Volume 3. All these ambiguities, arguments depend, once again, on the confusion between the thought concrete, which Marx completely isolated from the real concrete in the introduction, and this same real concrete, whereas in reality, the concrete of Volume 3, i.e. the knowledge of ground rent, profit, and interest, is like all knowledge, not the empirical concrete, but the concept. And therefore still always an abstraction. What I've been able to and have had to call a, quote, generality 3, end quote, in order to stress that it was still a product of thinking, the knowledge of an empirical existence, and not the empirical existence itself. It is therefore essential to be rigorous and draw the conclusion that the transition from Volume 1 to Volume 3 of Capital has nothing to do with the transition from the abstract in thought to the real concrete, with the transition from the abstractions of thought necessary in order to know it to the empirical concrete. It is therefore essential to be rigorous and draw the conclusion that the transition from Volume 1 to Volume 3 of Capital has nothing to do with the transition from the abstract in thought to the real concrete, with the transition from the abstractions of thought necessary in order to know it to the empirical concrete. We never leave abstraction on the way from Volume 1 to Volume 3, i.e. we never leave the, quote, product of thinking and conceiving, end quote. We never leave the concept. We simply pass within the abstraction of knowledge from the concept of the structure of its most general effects to the concepts of the structure's particular effects. Never for an instant do we set foot beyond the absolutely impassable frontier which separates the, quote, development, end quote, or specification of the concept from the development and particularity of things, and for a very good reason. This frontier is impassable in principle because it cannot be a frontier, because there is no common homogeneous space, mental or real, between the abstract of the concept of a thing and the empirical concrete of this thing, which could justify the use of the concept of a frontier. This frontier is impassable in principle because it cannot be a frontier, because there is no common homogeneous space, mental or real, between the abstract of the concept of a thing and the empirical concrete of this thing, which could justify the use of a concept of a frontier. I am very insistent on this ambiguity, but I want to show clearly the difficulty Marx found when he had to think in a really effective, reflected concept, the epistemological problem which he had nevertheless produced. How was he to account theoretically for the effectivity of a structure on its element? How is he to account theoretically for the effectivity of a structure on its elements? Sorry, it is plural elements. This difficulty was not without its consequences. I have pointed out that theoretical reflection before Marx had provided two, and only two, models in thought for an effectivity: the model of a transitive causality, Galilean and Cartesian in origin, and the model of an expressive causality, Leibnizian in origin and adopted by Hegel. But by playing on the ambiguity of the two concepts, these two models could quite easily find common ground in the classical opposition between phenomenon and essence. The ambiguity of these concepts is indeed obvious. The essence does refer to the phenomenon, but at the same time secretly to the inessential. The phenomenon does refer to the essence of what it can be, the essence of which it can be the manifestation and the expression. But at the same time and secretly, the phenomenon refers to what appears to be an empirical subject, to perception, and therefore to the empirical state of mind of a possible empirical subject. It then becomes quite simple to locate these ambiguous determinations in reality itself, to locate in the real itself, a distinction which is only meaningful as a function of a distinction outside the real, since it brings into play a distinction between the real and the knowledge of the real, in this search for a concept with which it to think the remarkable reality of the effectivity of a structure on its elements. Marx often slipped into the real, almost inevitable use of the classical opposition between essence and phenomenon, adopting its ambiguities by force rather than merit, and transposing the epistemological difference between the knowledge of a reality and that reality itself into reality in the form of the, quote, inside and the outside, end quote, of the real, of the, quote, real movement and the apparent movement, end quote, of the, quote, intimate essence, end quote, and its concrete phenomenal determinations perceived and manipulated by subjects. It then becomes quite simple to accumulate these ambiguous determinations in reality itself, to locate in the real itself a distinction which is only meaningful as a function of a distinction outside the real, since it brings into play a distinction between the real and the knowledge of the real. In his search for a concept with which to think the remarkable reality of the effectivity of a structure on its elements, Marx often slipped into the really almost inevitable use of the classical opposition between essence and phenomenon, adopting its ambiguities by force rather than merit, and transposing the epistemological difference between the knowledge of reality and that reality itself into reality in the form of the, quote, inside and the outside, end quote, of the real, of the, quote, real movement and apparent movement, end quote, of the, quote, intimate essence, end quote, and its concrete phenomenal determinations perceived and manipulated by the subjects. There are surely consequences in this for his conception of science, as we could have seen when Marx had to provide the concept of what his predecessors had either found or missed, or the concept of the difference between himself and them. But there were also consequences in this ambiguity for the interpretation of the phenomenon he baptized, quote, fetishism, end quote. We have shown that fetishism is not a subjective phenomenon related either to the illusions or to the perceptions of the agents of the economic process, that it cannot be reduced, therefore, to these subjective effects produced in the economic subjects by their place in the process, their site in the structure. But how many of Marx's texts present fetishism as a, quote, appearance, end quote, a, quote, illusion, end quote, arising purely in, quote, consciousness, end quote, show us the real inner movement of the process, quote, appearing, end quote, in a fetishized form to the, quote, consciousness, end quote, of the same subjects in the form of the apparent movement. And yet how many other texts of Marx's assure us that this appearance is not subjective at all, but on the contrary, objective through and through, the, quote, illusions, end quote, of the, quote, consciousness, end quote, and perceptions being itself secondary and dislocated by the structure of this primary, purely objective, quote, illusion, end quote. At this point, we see Marx most clearly struggling with reference concepts which are immediate to their objects, now accepting, now rejecting them in a necessarily contradictory movement. However, and by virtue of these same contradictory hesitations, Marx often takes the side of what he was actually saying, and he then produces concepts adequate to their object, and it is just as if, producing them in a lightning gesture, he had not marshaled and confronted this production theoretically, had not reflected it in order to impose it on the total field of his analysis. For example, when dealing with the rate of profit, Marx wrote, quote, in fact, the ratio of surplus value to total capital expresses the degree of valorization of the total capital advanced, i.e., viewed in accordance with the conceptual inner conception, dem begrifflichen inneren Zusammenhang entsprechend gefasst, and the actual nature of surplus value, end quote, Capital Volume 3. In this passage, and in several others, Marx is unambiguously, quote, practicing, end quote, the truth that interiority is nothing but the, quote, concept, end quote, that it is not the real, quote, interior, end quote, of the phenomena, but knowledge of it. If this is true, the reality that Marx studies can no longer be presented as a two-level reality, inside and outside, the inside being identified with the pure essence, and the outside with a phenomena, sometimes purely subjective, the state of mind of a, quote, consciousness, end quote, sometimes impure, because it is foreign to the essence, or inessential. If the, quote, inside, end quote, is the concept, if the, quote, inside, end quote, is the concept, the, quote, outside, end quote, can only be the specification of the concept, exactly as the effects of the structure of the whole can only be the existence of the structure itself. Here, for example, is what Marx says of ground rent. Quote, important as it is for the scientific analysis of ground rent, i.e. the autonomous specific economic form of landed property on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, to consider it in pure form, and free from adulterations and blurring admixtures, is just as important for understanding the practical effects of landed property, and even for theoretical insight into a mass of facts, that contradict the concept and nature of ground rent, and yet appear as ground rent's modes of existence. To know the elements from which these obscurities in the theory arise, end quote. Marx. Here we have in black and white the double status Marx attributes to his analysis. He is analyzing a pure form which is none other than the concept of capitalist ground rent. He thinks this purity both as the modality and the definition of the concept, and at the same time he thinks it as what he distinguishes from empirical impurity. Still, Marx does at once think this same empirical impurity in a second correcting movement as the, quote, modes of existence, end quote, modes of existence, end quote, i.e. as theoretical determinations of the concept of ground rent itself. In this latter conception, we leave the empiricist distinction between pure essence and pure phenomenon. We abandon the empiricist idea of a purity, which is thus only the result of an empirical purge. Since it is a purge of the empirical, We really think the purity of the concept, the purity of the concept, the purity of a knowledge adequate to its object, and the determinations of this concept as the effective knowledge of the modes of existence of ground rent. It is clear that this language itself revokes the distinction between inside and outside, and substitute for it the distinction between the concept and the real, or between the object of knowledge and the real object. But if we take this indispensable substitution seriously, it directs us towards a conception of scientific practice and of its object, which no longer has anything in common with empiricism. Marx states unambiguously the principles of this quite different conception of scientific practice in the 1857 introduction, but it is one thing to develop this concept and quite another to set this concept to work in order to solve the unprecedented theoretical problem of the production of the concept of the effectivity of a structure on its elements. We have seen Marx practicing this concept in the use he makes of the, quote, Darstellung, end quote, and trying to pinpoint it in the images of changes in the illumination or in the specific weight of objects by the ether in which they are immersed. And it is sometimes directly exposed in Marx's analyses, in passages where it is expressed in a novel but extremely precise language, a language of metaphors which are nevertheless already almost perfect concepts. A language of metaphors which are nevertheless already almost perfect concepts, and which are perhaps only incomplete insofar as they have not been grasped, i.e. retained and elaborated as concepts. This is the case each time Marx presents the capitalist system as a mechanism, a machinery, a machine, a construction. Triebwerk, Mechanismus, Getriebe, ... capital volume 3, or as the complexity of a, quote, social metabolism, end quote. In every case, the ordinary distinctions between outside and inside disappear, along with the, quote, the, quote, intimate, end quote, links within the phenomena, as opposed to their visible disorder. We find a different image, a new quasi-concept, definitely freed from the empiricist antinomies of phenomenal subjectivity and essential interiority. We find an objective system governed in its most concrete determinations by the laws of its erection, montage, and machinery. The laws of its erection, montage, and machinery, by the specification of its concept. We can now recall the highly symptomatic term, quote, Darstellung, end quote, compare it with this, quote, machinery, end quote, and take it literally, as the very existence of this machinery in its effects, the mode of existence of the stage direction, mise en scène, of the theater, which is simultaneously its own image, its own script, its own actors, the theater whose spectators can, on occasion, be spectators only because they are first of all forced to be its actors, caught by the constraints of a script, and parts whose authors they cannot be, since it is in essence an authorless theater. Need I add anything more? Marx's repeated efforts to break down the objective limits of the existing capital T theoretical, in order to forge a way of thinking the question that his scientific discovery has posed philosophy, his failures and even his relapses are a part of the theoretical drama he lived in absolute solitude long ago, and we are only just beginning to suspect from the signs in our heavens that his question is our question and will be for a long time, that it commands our whole future. Alone, Marx looked around him for allies and supporters. Who can reproach him for allowing himself to lean on Hegel? As for us, we can thank Marx for the fact that we are not alone. Our solitude only lies in our ignorance of what he said. We should accuse this ignorance in us and in all those who think they have forestalled him, and I only include the best of them, when they were only on the threshold of the land he discovered and opened for us. We even owe it to him that we can see his weaknesses, his lacunae, his omissions. They concur with Marx's greatness, for in returning to them, we are only returning to the beginnings of a discourse interrupted by death. The reader will know how Volume 3 ends, a title, classes, 40 lines, then silence. The end. That is the end of Chapter 9 of The Object of Capital by Louis Althusser. Next up is the Appendix on the, quote, ideal average, and, quote, and the forms of transition. Thank you for listening.